Hi, my name is Drew Fruget, and today I'll be presenting our data on the raised bed home vegetable garden project that we've been working on for 2 years now. We are myself, a PhD candidate, and my advisor, Sylvia Bird, is a registered dietitian. We're both in the Department of Food Science, Nutrition, and Health Promotion at Mississippi State University. Pete Melby is our landscape architect, and David Nagel is the state vegetable specialist. So just to give you an outline of what I'll be talking about today, first I'll give you background information on this project, and on the right you can see part of our raised bed garden, and then define the problem that which was solved through this analysis today. Methods of data collection and analysis, and share the results and a little bit of discussion. The home food production garden model that Pete Melby developed back in 2010 and 11. And in the South, this is a typical half acre lot that you would have a decent sized backyard, and so up until the last 2 decades, many yards were built this way. And so you can see here in the back we have four 40-foot by 3-foot raised bed gardens, and then we have bushes, trees, and vines that all produce fruits on the boundary of the lot. And so obviously it would take time for these fruiting trees to be productive enough, but the idea was that all of this could produce the fruits and vegetables for 5 servings a day for a family of 4 in this house. And so in the spring of 2012, we replicated that garden on our campus. And this first garden was grown mainly to be aesthetically pleasing. So you can see these are actually red and green cabbage. We had red and green beets. We had rainbow chard and various types of radishes, and interplanted with carrots. So there's a lot of color here, and that's ideally what you want when you're planting a garden. But we learned a lot from this with how much lettuce you can produce versus how much you'll actually want to eat. The same is true with spinach. And so our model that we're going to talk about today is based on what we've learned from this. And here's the first fall planting we had, and the first summer. So if you see any health statistics on the United States, you'll see that generally the southern states are the least healthy. And we attribute that generally to the standard American diet, which is lots of prepackaged foods, lots of fast foods, so things that are generally created to do nothing but stimulate us, so we will want to eat more. Whereas nature has provided us with very few of those things that we're going to overeat or that will affect our hormones irregularly, like these foods in our standard diet. One of the arguments that can be made on behalf of the Southeast is that there are these things called food deserts. So places where people can't go to buy fresh fruits and vegetables within maybe 30 or even 60 miles. And so their access is limited. So what we're proposing is that when they grow their own food, that access is drastically increased, as well as their nutrients. There's also research to confirm that when children have gardens, especially school gardens, there's been a lot of research, when they pick those fruits and vegetables, when they cook those vegetables, they're a lot more likely to eat them. And so it's this ownership, and the same is true with adults, that when we're a part of that production, we're going to have a lot more reverence for it, and we will in turn make sure it's not wasted. So, approaching this from a policy perspective, we wanted to ask the question, is this financially feasible? And what are the costs? What are the benefits? What if we subsidize the costs and then people are able to just reap the benefits? But is there a dollar value to that? And so that is how we approached this. So first we had to estimate the cost. We knew how much it cost to build our raised beds, but we wanted to make sure this was a very methodical process, and we used the Department of Agricultural Economics budget income statements for estimating these, and you'll see what that looks like in a minute. But we had to think about drip irrigation. We had to think about pesticides, fungicides, herbicides. Even if you use organic, those will be expensive, and so we had to also consider the water that we're going to put through that irrigation system. And so all these things do add up, and there's different ways to look at them. But for our base model, we take a very high-end approach to these costs and overestimate them just to reiterate the value. Also, we need to look at yields. Our extension service has produced the garden tabloid, and they've got numbers on the amounts of produce that you can expect from 100 feet of planted row. And so we looked at that, and in our first year we compared those expected yields to what we actually produced, and found that depending on the season we were below or above those production averages. But also, when you harvest, say, 5 pounds of carrots, they've got big green heads, and so those aren't edible. So we have to look at what's the edible portion, what's the ready-to-eat portion. And we found, testing the national database on that for child nutrition, that our yields were very similar to those when we were looking at harvested weight versus edible weight. And so that goes into our model as well. And then finally, we look at the economic value of this produce. So the USDA Economic Research Service published numbers in 2009 for the average U.S. retail value of almost all the vegetables that we have put in this garden model. And of course, in the model, we also have to adjust it for inflation. So from 2008 to 2013, there was 7% inflation. So $1 worth of produce then would now cost $1.07 now. So first, to find out what this value of our garden is, we've got to look at our income and expenses. So what are you getting versus what are you spending? So in this case, we're not necessarily selling our produce, so that income instead we're going to talk about as savings. So how much did we save on produce because we are growing it? And so that difference for each year is that year's cash flow. And then what we'll do is this is a 5-year analysis, we'll take each of those cash flows and we will discount them based on our 10% discount rate to see what they're worth in today's dollars. And so 10% was chosen. It's a very, very conservative number. Usually most investments, you would expect 5% at this time. And so 10% was also very conservative. Next, we take that 5-year NPV and we stress test it. We look at how that value holds up under different conditions. And so we have 5 levels of productivity. So the average that I'll show you in a minute is assuming average productivity. And then we look at 50%, 75%, up to 150%. And the same is true with labor. We're going to look at a very low hands-off approach versus a very labor-intensive approach. And obviously, we've got to pay for hours spent in the garden. For the micronutrient analysis, we took the USDA's National Nutrient Database for standard reference. It's actually version 24 that we used, and applied each micronutrient value, so vitamins, minerals, even included fiber for this analysis, and used the dietary reference intake, which is what the Institute of Medicine says will make the majority of the population healthy if they consume these certain amounts. So it's broken down by age and sex, and so we chose a 31 to 50-year-old female as our reference person for this analysis. And so we took each vegetable's nutrients, how much of that vegetable we produced, and found the total nutrients that came out of the garden, just the same way we do servings. And so then we can look at, using that daily reference intake, what would that contribute to each person's diet on average in a family of 4 over the course of the year. So when we look at our yields, we have to consider a few things. Each 4-foot, 40-foot by 3-foot garden is going to be 40 row feet. So 40 times 4 beds would be 160 row feet per season. And so we have 3 seasons here in the South. We're usually going to plant around February, August, and May, April. So that winter season is usually pretty short growing season. But depending on the weather, we can let certain vegetables stay in the ground longer or keep producing. And so we've had a very mild year this year. And so that's kind of affected the timing of when we planted and how long other things stayed in the ground. But you run into a problem when you're planting this, because looking at broccoli, there's a floret as well as a leaf that are both edible. Obviously, you're not going to see broccoli leaves in most grocery stores, but they're very similar in nutrient composition to collards, and cauliflower leaves are the same way, and they're a lot like collards. It's the same family of plants. Also, root vegetables like beets and turnips are going to have edible leaves as well, and so to account for that, you have to add that into your model, and so you'll actually have a higher amount of row feet planted. So we'll work from left to right on this slide. You can see that, and this is just a selection of some of the vegetables that we did, but we have our different vegetables and the servings per foot, and so this is obviously a calculated amount, but that's going to show us how densely each of these vegetables is going to produce. So you see the eggplant and sweet peppers, which sweet peppers are very dependent on hot weather in the summer for high production. And then tomatoes, if you get them in the ground early enough, can produce for 4 or 5 months. So we actually got some in March that are still producing now. And so this next feet planted, if you're planting your own garden, you can change this, but this is the way our model is designed. And then you have the servings that you're going to get. So high production, high amount of foot planted, and 264 servings. That's over 80 pounds of tomatoes. So our next column is the value per serving. So again, that's bringing in that 2008 average retail price. And then we can bring these two numbers together. If we know the servings per foot and the value per servings, we can estimate the amount that piece of ground is worth when it's got a certain vegetable. So planting red potatoes is not necessarily a lucrative use of green space, or maybe even beets, but if we're eating the beets and the beet greens, that looks like a lot better number than if you would throw the greens away, which has happened. In the last column, we get our total value from this choice of plant, this amount of feet planted, and the value of that serving. And so when we run this for all of our vegetables in the model, then we have a total of 580 row feet planted. There are 100, I told you 480 was our number, but since we had 100 feet of these doubly producing vegetables, we have 580 feet. Again, there are 3 growing seasons. So that brought us to an average of 37 cents per serving value and a total of 3,582 servings, which is a lot of vegetables. So a total of an average of 9.8 per day. And obviously different vegetables are going to produce at different rates for various reasons. So you'll need to have ways of processing these. So you'll want to learn to can and freeze, and some will store, like your sweet potatoes and potatoes. You can keep in cool, dark storage for a very long time. So that's part of this vegetable choice as well. But we've got 3,582 servings at 37 cents a serving, and that is $1,348 in that 2008 price. So we want to adjust it for inflation, and that's $1,456, and that's a lot of money for something that basically grows itself. So now we have to look at the expenses. There's that 1456 carried over from the data I just showed you, and then we've got our different expenses. And so I mainly want to point to this irrigation, supplies, and water. That's 277.11. Also, we look at labor, and so that's going to be $9.30 an hour, and you can see that down here. In this first model, we've got 80 hours for this year one expenses, and the following years that'll only be 70 hours, but we got to spend 10 hours putting together our garden and filling it with soil, setting up irrigation, and so that's how that figures in. So our total expenses are $1,337 subtracted from $1,456 is $119. So in the first year, with average yields, 70 hours of labor plus that 10 to build it, you're coming out positive with $119. So next we want to look at that over 5 years, and this is where our net present value comes in. And so we look at the 5-year totals, and there's that 119 from our first year, and then without that extra 10 hours of labor and cost to set up our beds, that goes to 394. And so compounding these cash flows back to year 0, we get a positive NPV of 1243. And in financial terms, any net present value that's positive is an investment worth our time. So our sensitivity analysis is like a stress test. We change our inputs and see how it affects our overall cash flows. So you see, remember that 1243 was the NPV we just looked at in our base model. And so 70 hours a year is only about 80 minutes a week, which is a lot, considering how little time it takes to manage these raised bed gardens. And so at 100% of average production, we're going to have a positive NPV, no matter how much labor we put in. But as we decrease production, which our first spring garden was about 75% of expected, the more time you put into it, the more likely that this will be a negative NPV. But you would think the more time you put in, 70, 80 hours a year, the higher your production would be, which makes sense when we come over and look, if we only put 45 minutes a week and weather's terrible, water's terrible, we may only have this 50% yield, but that's still a very low negative NPV. But if 50% yield at any level of labor input, we're going to have a negative NPV. And so the question then, well, what if you made that labor cost zero? So what if I'm not working and it really doesn't cost me time? Well, then all these are positive. And so that's something that we would consider from a policy perspective. Now look at the micronutrients. Remember, this is broken down. We had 9.8 servings per day, 2.45 per person in a family of 4. And there's a pretty substantial amount of these minerals. Of course, that included fiber. We've got a good bit of these minerals, particularly high amount of manganese. And then looking at our vitamins, very high vitamin C, low B vitamins, all the way down to 0 for B12, which is why you would have a complete diet when you include meat, eggs, seafood, nuts for these B vitamins. But then you look at our fat soluble vitamins, and you get a lot of vitamin A in the form of carotenoids, and vitamin K in a form that's got to be converted in our body. So what we actually get out of that is still very high, but not quite 516%. So to wrap it up, our main cost is labor. And when we take that out of the equation, then the first year expenses are really the only thing, because you can save seeds. You can spend less than $100 a year on watering the garden, especially if you have a rainy year. So from a policy standpoint, we could provide materials, provide education to these rural families and have zero food insecurity. We can fix that. Also, we look at the nutrients and we see that if we can displace some of the consumption of the American diet with fruits and vegetables, we're going to drastically increase our micronutrient intake, but also eat less of those empty calories from junk food. And so, I never mentioned it, but fresh vegetables are delicious. And on top of that, they're nutritive, and to be able to do this yourself is certainly cost effective. So if you have any questions, please email me, adf93@msstate.edu. And also, if you want this reference list, I can send that to you if you'll email me as well. Thank you very much for your time.